as the wooden rafters of a forgotten timberline patrol cabin groan under the weight of wet alpine snow. The stark terror of freezing to death is suddenly cut by the deep ring of solid brass. It is the unmistakable clink of a heavy brass belt buckle unclasping in the dark, a sound that forces a shivering wrangler to face the raw, unvarnished heat of the only man who can save him. The storm outside is a shrieking wall of ice, but inside the cramped space, the silence is the loudest thing he has ever been inside. The early October blizzard had not announced itself. It had simply swept over the jagged peaks and swallowed the timberline in a wall of blinding, merciless white. William Morrison, known strictly to the crew as Billy, pushed his exhausted gelding through a rising snowdrift. The stray yearlings they had been sent to retrieve were scattering into the underbrush, their panic bellows swallowed by the shrieking wind. Every breath Billy dragged into his lungs felt like inhaling crushed glass. The temperature was plummeting, turning the sweat on the back of his neck into a collar of solid ice. He rode exactly 10 yards behind Benjamin Vance. The massive Foreman sat his dark roan horse like a monument carved from the mountain itself. Ben did not shout instructions. He did not need to. The man commanded the respect of the entire territory simply by existing within it. Billy kept his eyes fixed on the broad expanse of Ben's back, determined not to be the weak link on his first high-range drive. He had spent his whole life scraping by on the fringes of society. He would rather freeze in the saddle than give the giant Foreman a reason to send him away. Billy's wet denim jeans, soaked through from the initial sleet, were rapidly stiffening against his trembling legs. His woolen shirt felt like a cage of frost. Through the blinding snow, he realized the frozen leather strap of his horse's bridle was slipping dangerously near the bit. Billy pulled a trembling hand from the inadequate shelter of his coat pocket, exposing his bare skin to the brutal wind, and reached forward over the saddle horn. His fingers were stiff, clumsy, and entirely numb. He fumbled with the iron buckle, his knuckles scraping painfully against the horse's frozen mane. But there was no sensation left in his fingertips to gauge his grip. He gritted his teeth, refusing to show mounting fatigue. He knew the giant Foreman missed nothing. Ben's storm-gray eyes were constantly scanning the horizon, registering the weather with unblinking precision. Billy tried desperately to force his lifeless fingers to pinch the stiff leather, masking his violent shivering by locking his jaw. He would fix the bridle, keep his head down, and prove he belonged here, even as the cold seeped into his bones. The afternoon light vanished entirely, buried under the relentless onslaught of the snowstorm. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees in the span of a single mile. Billy could no longer feel his toes inside his worn boots, and his hands had transitioned to a terrifying, pale blue numbness. He tried to grip the stiff reins to guide his horse back toward the trail, but his fingers would not close. The joints had locked. The frozen leather slipped helplessly through his useless palms, leaving his gelding to falter and turn away from the driving wind. Panic spiked deep in Billy's chest. The frontier did not forgive weakness. Every man who rode through this harsh country learned that truth the hard way. He frantically tried to wrap the slack reins around his wrist using his forearms, but his hands were entirely unresponsive, hanging at his sides like dead weight. The horse drifted further off the invisible trail, fighting the deep snow. Billy squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. He anticipated a harsh shout over the wind, the crushing reality of being told he was a liability to the herd. Instead, a massive shadow fell over him, blocking the brunt of the shrieking blizzard. Ben's enormous roan horse was suddenly flanking his own, pressing in so close that their heavy leather stirrups clattered together. The Foreman did not yell. He did not issue a single word of reprimand. He simply leaned over the saddle. His sheer physica bend took control of the horse, pulling the reins from Billy's useless fingers. In the process, the back of the Foreman's knuckles brushed briefly against Billy's frozen wrists. The touch was fleeting, but the raw, radiating heat from the Foreman's grip was an absolute shock to Billy's failing system. Ben calmly looped the leather strap around his own massive fist, anchoring Billy's drifting horse securely to his side. He kept his gaze fixed straight ahead into the blinding white, his jaw set in a hard, immovable line. There was no judgment in the heavy silence that fell between them, only the quiet assertion of total protection. As Ben's horse carved the path forward, pulling Billy along in its wake, the overwhelming terror of the storm began to recede. It was replaced by the terrifying realization that he had just surrendered his life into the hands of a man who showed no intention of letting him fall. The wind did not howl so much as it screamed, a solid physical force of white moving horizontally across the timberline. The October blizzard had swallowed the Wyoming landscape whole, erasing the trail, the sky, and the very concept of direction. Every step forward was a violent negotiation with the mountain. The snow was already knee-deep, heavy and wet, clinging to the frozen leather of their stirrups like iron weights. The cold was a living, breathing entity out here, sinking its teeth through wool and denim, searching for the fragile heat of blood underneath. Tethered to the massive Foreman, William Morrison fought to stay upright in the saddle. The young wrangler's breathing was ragged, a series of short, shallow gasps snatched away by the gale before they could even form clouds in the freezing air. Billy kept his eyes fixed on the broad expanse of Ben's back, tracking the dark wool of his coat as the only anchor in a world that had dissolved into a blinding chaos of ice and howling noise. He was operating purely on the instinct of obedience, placing his freezing boots exactly in the deep prints left by the older man. They reached the structure suddenly, nearly colliding with its snow-packed walls before the shape of it emerged from the storm. It was an abandoned patrol cabin, a relic left behind by boundary riders years ago. It offered no welcoming light, no promise of comfort. It was merely a rotting box of pine logs, leaning heavily against the side of the ridge, half buried under the mounting drift. The roof sagged under the weight of 3 feet of wet alpine snow, and the single window was boarded shut with warped, splintering timber. Ben did not pause to evaluate it. He grabbed the rusted iron latch of the door and pulled, but the wood had swollen and frozen solid into the frame. The ice sealed it shut, mocking their desperation. Billy stood a few paces back, his arms wrapped tight around his own chest, violently trembling as the cold sank deeper into his bones, stiffening the wet denim jeans that clung to his legs like a second layer of frost. With a low guttural grunt that barely registered over the roaring wind, the foreman stepped back, planted his massive boots in the snow, and brought his heel up. He kicked the door directly beside the latch. The impact was a heavy, percussive thud that vibrated through the freezing air. It didn't yield. He drew his leg back and kicked it again, harder this time. The ancient frozen wood groaned, then splintered violently inward with a sharp crack that echoed like a rifle shot against the howling gale. The door smashed against the interior wall, tearing free of its bottom hinge, and a cloud of stale, freezing dust puffed out from the dark gap. Ben turned, reaching out one calloused hand to grab the younger man by the shoulder of his soaked coat. The grip was immovable, an absolute command disguised as a physical anchor. He hauled the shivering youth over the threshold and into the pitch-black, freezing belly of the shack, then dragged the splintered door partially shut behind them, scraping it against the dirt to wedge it in place, cutting the wind down to a localized, hissing draft that swept across the floorboards. The silence inside the cabin was the loudest thing Billy had ever been inside, a heavy, suffocating quiet that did nothing to stop the relentless freezing of his blood. The air in the shack was dead, smelling of dry rot, old earth, and the metallic tang of deep frost. The dark was nearly absolute, pierced only by thin gray blades of light filtering through the gaps in the warped logs. Wind screamed around the exterior corners, shaking the roof beams until dust and dry pine needles drifted down onto their heads. Matches, the foreman's voice came low and rough, cutting through the gloom. It was a practical demand, devoid of panic, a sound that required a functional response. The young wrangler nodded, though the motion was jerky, involuntary. He patted his soaked coat pockets, his arms moving with the sluggish, uncoordinated heaviness of a man functioning underwater. He finally located the small brass tin in his inner breast pocket. He pulled it out, but his hands refused to work properly. He stared down at his own fingers in the dim light. They were a lifeless, pale blue, the knuckles white and stiff, resembling the hands of a corpse rather than living flesh. He couldn't feel the cold in them anymore, only a heavy, numb uselessness that terrified him more than the pain had. He knelt on the hard dirt floor near a crumbling stone hearth, where someone years ago had left a small heap of ancient, decaying kindling. Billy tried to pry the lid off the match tin. His blue thumb slipped against the smooth metal. He pressed harder, his breath hitching in a series of wet, shallow stutters. The lid popped free, but his grip was so compromised that the tin twisted awkwardly in his palm. Half a dozen matches spilled out, scattering onto the freezing dirt. He cursed, a weak, reedy sound, and bent closer to the ground, frantically trying to pinch one of the wooden sticks between his thumb and forefinger. His hand shook violently. The match slipped from his grasp and fell back into the dirt. He tried again, managing to drag the sulfur head against the striking surface of the tin. His hand trembled so erratically that the match merely scraped against the metal without sparking, the friction entirely lost to his uncoordinated movements. The cold was invading his core now, bypassing the wet flannel shirt and the frozen denim. His entire skeletal frame was shaking in a violent, uncontrollable rhythm. He tried to strike the match a third time, pressing his lips tightly together to steady himself. His teeth were chattering with such brutal, mechanical force that as his jaw clamped down, he accidentally caught the edge of his own lower lip. The sharp, sudden pain bloomed bright and hot in the freezing dark. He tasted copper. A bead of dark blood swelled on his split lip, but the air inside the drafty shack was so fundamentally hostile that the drop seemed to freeze almost instantly, turning into a tiny, painful crystal against his skin. He dropped the match again, watching it roll away into the dust. A wave of raw, deeply repressed panic began to rise in his chest, a sickening realization that his body was failing him completely. The iron rules of frontier survival were finally demanding their toll, and he did not have the physical strength to pay it. He reached for another match, his blue fingers clawing uselessly at the dirt, scraping his numb nails against the frozen earth in a desperate, pathetic attempt to find warmth that simply wasn't there. Benjamin Vance did not waste a second breath on the failed matches scattered across the frozen dirt floor. The massive Foreman turned his attention entirely away from the shivering youth and focused on the crumbling sandstone hearth dominating the far wall of the shack. It was a crude, brutal structure, built decades ago by desperate men who only cared about surviving the night, the heavy stones blackened by the smoke of 100 previous blizzards. Beside the hearth sat a low, disorganized stack of split pine. In a dime novel, this would be the moment the rugged hero struck a piece of flint, the dry tinder catching instantly, filling the bleak room with golden light and life-saving heat. But the Wyoming timberline did not operate on fiction, and the desert of ice outside did not forgive weakness. The reality of the high range was much crueler, and the older man knew the mechanical arithmetic of winter survival better than any rider in the territory. He dropped heavily to one knee, the floorboards groaning under his immense weight. The sheer physical scale of the man made the cramped, rotting cabin feel even more suffocating, his broad shoulders blocking what little gray, dying light filtered through the iced-over window pane. He reached out with a rough hand, his thick fingers wrapping around the top log of the pile. He did not pull the timber toward the iron grate. Instead, Ben pressed his heavy, calloused thumb directly into the center of the split wood. The silence inside the room was absolute, save for the violent hammering of the wind tearing at the cedar shingles above, but the sickening squelch of water was unmistakable. Moisture seeped outward from the rotted grain under the intense, crushing pressure of the foreman's grip, pooling dark and muddy against his palm. The entire pile had been sitting directly beneath a jagged leak in the roof for months. It was not just damp on the surface. The wood was soaked completely through to the pith, effectively turned to a heavy, frozen sponge of decay. The giant wiped the muddy water onto his thigh with a slow, deliberate motion. He let out a long, measured breath that plumed white in the freezing air, his storm-gray eyes assessing the structural reality of their doom. He gave a grim, singular shake of his head. There would be no fire. Even if they managed to catch a fragile spark on a shred of dry moss, the wet pine would only smolder and smoke, choking them blindly in the enclosed space long before it produced a single ounce of heat. They were trapped in a windowless wooden box that was rapidly matching the sub-zero temperature of the screaming storm outside. The hearth was a useless monument to past riders. The only heat left in the world was whatever blood still managed to stubbornly pump through their own veins. Ben stood up slowly, bringing his full, intimidating height back into the shadows of the room. He turned his attention back to the shivering wrangler huddled near the doorway. William Morrison was failing fast. The younger man's lips were tinted a bruised, dangerous shade of violet, and the violent tremors racking his lean frame were beginning to slow down into sluggish twitches. It was the final, lethal stage before the body simply surrendered to the cold and shut the organs down. Ben stepped closer, his heavy leather boots thudding deliberately on the frost-heaved planks, closing the distance between them. "Take them off," the foreman ordered. The command was not harsh, but it carried the absolute, unyielding authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed instantly on the open range. His voice came low and rough, like whiskey poured over gravel, cutting straight through the howl of the storm. Billy blinked, his sluggish brain struggling to process the spoken words through the thick, suffocating fog of hypothermia. His jaw trembled so violently that his teeth audibly clicked together. "What?" His voice cracked, fragile, broken sound that barely managed to leave his throat. "The clothes, boy," Ben clarified, gesturing with a heavy hand toward the younger man's shivering, ice-caked form. "They are frozen through. The dampness is going to stop your heart if you keep that ice pressed against your skin. Strip out of those wet denim jeans and that flannel right now." The words landed like a physical blow to the stomach. The lethargy numbing Billy's mind vanished entirely, replaced in an instant by a blinding, razor-sharp spike of adrenaline. He clutched the wet denim jeans tightly at his thighs, his freezing fingers curling into the stiff fabric with desperate, white-knuckled force. His entire posture stiffened rigidly, his spine locking as a deep-rooted, paralyzing terror seized him. It was not the simple fear of the cold room, it was the absolute, suffocating dread of exposure. For years, Billy had survived by remaining strictly invisible. He had built an ironclad fortress of routine at the bunkhouse, rising an hour before dawn to wash in the dark, changing his shirts with his back turned strictly to the other hands, burying his history beneath thick layers of wool and canvas. Beneath his soaked clothing lay a roadmap of jagged, ugly marks, the permanent, raised evidence of a past life where showing any softness had been paid for with the lash and the fist. The thought of bearing those scars, of standing stripped and defenseless under the intense, evaluating gaze of the most physically imposing man he had ever known, made his lungs restrict in a violent panic. He would rather freeze. He would rather let the merciless winter claim him entirely than let this stoic giant look upon his ruined skin and see the broken, fragile thing he truly was. His jaw clamped shut as he desperately anchored his grip on the freezing fabric, his knuckles turning pure white as he refused to let go. When Ben took a single half-step forward to enforce the command, raw, primal instinct took over. William did not just step back, he violently recoiled. His frozen boots scraped harshly against the uneven, dirt-caked floorboards of the abandoned line shack, the sound unnaturally loud in the cramped space. The sudden, defensive movement forced his body to fight against the stiff, unyielding trap of his wet denim jeans. The heavy fabric, saturated with melted snow from the high ridge, had already begun to freeze solid around his knees and thighs. They moved like iron shackles dragging against his battered skin. But pure, unadulterated panic lent him a desperate, frantic strength. He stumbled backward, boots slipping on a patch of black ice near the doorway, until his shoulders slammed hard against the far wall of the cabin. The rough-hewn logs at his back were coated in a thick layer of white frost. The biting chill pierced straight through the soaked, icy layers of his flannel shirt, shocking his spine, but he barely registered the physical pain. His chest heaved, struggling violently to draw oxygen in the thin, high-altitude air. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, pluming into thick white clouds that dissipated rapidly in the suffocating gloom. He stared wildly at the massive silhouette of his boss. In the dim, gray shadows of the drafty shack, Benjamin Vance looked impossibly large, a towering wall of muscle and capability blocking the only exit for years. Billy had survived the merciless reality of the frontier by keeping his head down, doing the grueling ranch labor in silence, and hiding every trace of his own fragile humanity. His scars, both the raised, jagged tissue along his ribs and the deeper, unspoken marks of a past he refused to name, were his alone to carry, exposing his bare skin, stripping away the very armor he wore to navigate a hostile world. To a man who held total professional power over him, felt infinitely more dangerous than the encroaching cold. He pressed himself harder into the frozen timber, as if he could somehow push his way through the solid wood and escape back into the blinding blizzard. His hands, still a sickly, lifeless blue and entirely useless for gripping a rope or a rein, curled into rigid, trembling fists at his sides. He could not stop the violent, bone-rattling shivering that racked his lean frame, but he locked his jaw, his teeth clicking together as he refused to vocalize the terror that was drowning him. In his frost-addled, oxygen-starved mind, the practical, life-saving urgency of the foreman's command had twisted into a terrifying invasion of his personal space. He was cornered, trapped by the screaming mountain storm and by a man whose sheer physical scale could easily break him. The wind hammered against the corrugated tin roof, a chaotic, deafening roar that perfectly mirrored the frantic, desperate hammering of the young wrangler's heart. Ben stopped. The massive foreman had spent half his life reading the silent language of the frontier. The shift of the wind before a blizzard, the tension in a herd right before a stampede, the subtle tightening of a horse's flank before it bucked. He saw the wild, cornered look in the younger man's wide eyes and immediately understood. This was not the stubborn defiance of a ranch hand refusing a difficult chore. This was sheer blinding terror. The frustration that had been building in Ben's chest, the desperate need to act quickly before the cold stopped the boy's heart, evaporated instantly. He realized, with a heavy sinking feeling in his gut, that stepping forward now, using his physical size to enforce the command, would shatter whatever fragile trust they had built over the last few months of mending fences and riding the Kincaid Range. If he forced the issue, the boy would fight him, burning precious energy he did not have, or worse, he would retreat entirely into a state of shock from which he might not wake up. Ben's jaw tightened. He deliberately planted his boots on the floorboards and ceased all forward momentum. The foreman took a slow, deep breath, consciously bleeding the sharp edge of command from his posture. He let his broad shoulders drop, minimizing his towering height as much as a man of his immense stature possibly could in the cramped space. Slowly, carefully, Ben raised his hands. He kept his heavy, calloused palms open and turned outward in the dim light, showing the shivering wrangler that he held no threat, no intention of taking what was not freely given. It was the exact, deliberate motion a seasoned handler used to approach a spooked, violently trembling colt, a silent promise of safety in a world that offered very little of it. "Easy," Ben murmured. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, lacking the booming authority he usually carried across the dusty corral. Instead, it was steady and grounded, a deep vibration that seemed to cut right through the howling noise of the storm outside. "I'm not moving, boy, just breathe." The silence inside the small, claustrophobic perimeter of the shack felt heavier than the snow accumulating on the roof. Ben kept his eyes locked on William, tracking the shallow, erratic rise and fall of the frozen flannel shirt. He did not ask questions. He did not demand an explanation for the panic. The frontier had taught him long ago that a man's deepest wounds rarely needed to be spoken aloud to be understood. He simply stood his ground, offering his open hands and his steady presence, anchoring the room. The cold was still a deadly enemy, gnawing at the edges of the walls. But the foreman knew that the battle for the boy's survival had to be won in the mind before he could ever hope to save the body. The wind threw its entire weight against the patrol cabin, rattling the timber joints with a sound like splintering bone. But inside the narrow freezing room, the silence between the two men had become the loudest thing Billy had ever been inside. He remained pressed hard against the frozen log wall, his chest heaving in short, shallow gasps that plumed into white vapor in the bitter air. The biting chill was already creeping up his spine, threatening to shut his internal organs down completely if he did not generate heat soon. Every muscle in his wire frame was coiled tight, locked in a defensive paralysis that had nothing to do with the October blizzard and everything to do with the massive, unreadable authority figure standing only a few feet away. Ben did not step any closer. The giant of a foreman possessed the physical strength to drag his wrangler away from the wall and strip the ice from him by force. But he simply stood there, perfectly still, his storm-gray eyes registering the absolute terror in the younger man's wide, hyper-vigilant stare. Ben understood the wild, cornered look of a runaway who expected to be punished for his own fragility. Instead of issuing another harsh command that would only shatter whatever fragile trust existed between them, the older man deliberately lowered his hands. He did not reach for Billy. He reached for his own waist. The movement was slow, unhurried, heavily telegraphed so that Billy could track every inch of the motion. Ben's rough, calloused fingers, reddened from the biting frost, gripped the thick leather of his own work belt. These were the same hands that routinely wrestled 1,000-pound steers to the dust, now moving with a meticulous, gentle precision to defuse a terrified boy. In the agonizingly tense quiet of the drafty line shack, the sharp, metallic ring of his heavy brass belt buckle being unclasped cut through the howling wind outside. It was a loud, deliberate, echoing clink that sounded almost like the cocking of a heavy rifle in the cramped space, drawing Billy's fearful eyes sharply downward. The heavy brass belt buckle gave way, the stiff, freezing leather sliding through the metal loop with a heavy, scraping resistance. Billy flinched at the noise, his blue-tinged fingers digging desperately into the rough bark of the wall behind him. He watched, breath hitched in his throat, as the foreman systematically dismantled his own imposing armor. This was the man who dictated the law of the range, a man whose sheer physical scale and silent demeanor commanded absolute obedience from every hand in the bunkhouse, now deliberately taking himself apart in the freezing dark. The heavy brass belt buckle swung loose, hitting the wooden floorboards with a final, resonant thud that seemed to vibrate straight upward through the soles of Billy's numb boots. With his belt undone, Ben hooked his large thumbs into the waistband of his wet denim jeans. The heavy fabric was already stiffening with the encroaching frost, the icy moisture acting as a deadly conductor in the sub-zero temperature. Without a single word of hesitation, the massive foreman pushed the soaked trousers down over his hips, letting the freezing heavy material fall completely away. He stepped out of the wet denim jeans, kicking the rigid, icy fabric aside until it lay in a useless, crumpled heap against the far wall. The stiffened cotton landed with a heavy, hollow crunch, the ice crystals woven into the fabric breaking apart upon impact. The sudden, startling display of vulnerability from a man who was essentially carved from sandstone and iron left Billy completely stunned, his defensive panic suddenly colliding with utter bewilderment. Steam practically rose from Ben's immense heat-radiating skin into the frigid air of the cabin. The raw, imposing reality of his physical presence was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the grueling exhaustion of the cattle drive, yet he made no move to bridge the distance between them. Instead, as he stood there in the freezing gloom, shedding the last remnants of his professional authority, just to keep his heart beating, the older man looked down at the younger wrangler's wide, terrified eyes. And then, something impossible happened. The harsh, uncompromising lines of Ben's weathered face shifted. The deep creases around his eyes crinkled, and the rigid tension in his jaw melted away. The giant Foreman let out a rare, low-rumbling breath that might have been a chuckle, offering a dry, deeply protective grin that entirely transformed the frightening architecture of his features. It was not a mocking smirk, nor was it a joke at the younger man's expense. It was a quiet, rugged expression of absolute warmth, designed specifically to dismantle the suffocating terror gripping the room. "That was just my belt buckle, cowboy." Ben growled softly, his voice low and rough like whiskey poured over gravel. The words were spoken with an unhurried, steadying gravity, cutting a straight through the frantic, hammering pulse in Billy's ears. The dry, self-deprecating humor hung in the freezing air, a deliberate anchor thrown into the chaotic storm of the wrangler's panic. In the span of a single heartbeat, the strict, unyielding hierarchy of Jasper Kincaid's sprawling operation was completely dismantled. Ben was showing him, with absolute physical proof, that survival out here required the surrender of all pride, and that shedding their frozen layers was not an act of submission, but a shared, necessary defiance against the lethal cold. The heavy, stifling dread that had kept Billy pinned to the frost-covered logs began to crack, fractured by the unexpected, grounding reality of a massive man willing to look entirely foolish just to make him feel safe. The echo of the heavy brass hitting the floorboards hung in the bitter air. For a long, suspended second, the younger wrangler just stared at the massive silhouette before him. The sheer absurdity of the moment collided violently with the absolute terror that had locked his muscles into iron bands. Here was the most intimidating man on the range, a stoic giant whose mere glance usually sent the bunkhouse into panicked silence, standing half-naked in the freezing dark just to prove a point. The realization hit him like a physical blow, the absolute refusal of this man to let him freeze, even if it meant discarding every shred of his own dignity. A sound escaped William's throat. It was not a word, and it certainly wasn't a sob. It was a small, breathless laugh, a fragile, cracked noise that scraped against the silence of the cabin. It surprised him as much as it did the foreman, breaking past the rigid clamp of his jaw before immediately dissolving into a violent, heavy shiver. The physical exhaustion of panic finally gave way, draining the unnatural rigidity from his shoulders. His back slid a few inches down the rough, frozen log wall, his knees buckling slightly as the adrenaline receded, leaving only the profound ache of the cold. Benjamin did not move to close the distance immediately. The large man stood entirely still, allowing the sudden levity to settle. He let the younger man process the fact that the danger in this room came strictly from the winter storm outside. The foreman's eyes remained steady, holding a rare, dry warmth that stood in stark contrast to the howling wind battering the timberline roof. He was waiting. It was a deliberate, protective pause, granting the wrangler the agency to choose survival over his own deeply ingrained shame. The breathless laughter shook his frame again, rattling his ribs. His teeth clicked together audibly, a harsh castanet rhythm that he could not control. He wrapped his arms around his own torso, his pale blue fingers clutching the stiffened fabric of his coat. The ridiculousness of the situation remained, but the primal fear of being exposed, of being judged for his hidden vulnerabilities, was gone. It had been shattered completely by the simple, rough grace of a man willing to make himself just as exposed. The physical strain of the cold, however, was rapidly overtaking the relief. The laughter morphed into a shallow, gasping breath as the freezing temperature asserted its dominance. He looked up at the older man, his wide eyes finally losing their defensive glaze, replaced by a raw, silent plea for help. He could no longer feel his legs, and his hands were entirely useless. The tension had drained from him, but so had the last reserves of his independent strength. He was ready to surrender to the necessity of the moment, to let go of the rules of isolation he had carried for years. The foreman stepped forward, closing the space between them with slow, measured movements. There was no hesitation left in the younger man as Benjamin reached out, his massive hands hovering for a second to assure permission. When the wrangler offered a trembling, almost imperceptible nod, the giant went to work. The task required a terrifying level of patience, as the boy's clothes had effectively become a shell of ice. The wet denim jeans were rigid, frozen solid around the calves and thighs, acting as a direct conduit pulling the remaining heat from his slowing heart. Benjamin knelt on the frost-covered floorboards, his bare knees ignoring the biting cold of the wood. His calloused fingers gripped the hem of the stiff pants. The fabric did not bend, it cracked. The sound of ice breaking within the threads was sharp and unnatural in the enclosed space. He had to pry the material apart, working the frozen seams with a mechanical, deliberate force. It was tedious, grueling labor. The foreman pulled downward, but the wet denim jeans had literally begun to stick to the pale, shivering skin underneath, bonded by the freezing moisture. "Easy," the large man murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated beneath the noise of the blizzard. The single word was not a command, but an anchor meant to ground the panicked boy. Benjamin stopped pulling and instead pressed his broad, calloused palms directly against the outside of the frozen fabric over the wrangler's thighs. He used his own immense body heat to thaw the ice just enough to break the bond between cloth and flesh. The contrast was agonizing, the searing warmth of the foreman's hands pressing through the frigid barrier, forcing blood to rush back to the skin's surface. It took agonizing minutes to peel the ruined trousers down over the wrangler's boots, which had to be unlaced and dragged off with brute force. Once the legs were free, Benjamin stood, towering over the shivering figure, and moved to the stiff flannel shirt. The buttons were coated in a fine layer of rime, impossible to manage. The foreman did not bother trying to unfasten them. With a sudden controlled jerk, he tore the front of the shirt open, the sound of ripping cotton echoing loudly off the timber walls. The younger man gasped as the freezing wet fabric was peeled back from his shoulders. The cold air hit his bare chest, sending a violent spasm through his entire frame. He swayed dangerously on his feet, his knees finally giving out completely. But he did not hit the floor. Benjamin caught him effortlessly, one massive arm sweeping around the fragile, trembling torso, pulling the boy against his own broad, bare chest. The sheer scale of the older man provided an immediate barrier against the drafty room. The frozen clothes were kicked aside into a useless heap, leaving nothing between them but the harsh necessity of shared survival. The narrow wooden bunk sat in the darkest corner of the abandoned line shack, a crude frame of split pine boards and sagging rope lattice that had clearly been built for a solitary patrolman. It was a miserable, punishing piece of furniture, stripped of any mattress, leaving only the hard, uneven timber exposed to the freezing air. Benjamin Vance did not hesitate. His massive hands, steady and entirely devoid of the paralyzing panic that had nearly consumed his wrangler moments prior, guided William Morrison toward the corner. The floorboards groaned under Ben's immense weight, the sharp sound nearly lost beneath the relentless howling of the October blizzard outside. The wind was a living, malicious thing, tearing at the rotting cedar shingles and forcing fine, powdery snow through the invisible gaps in the log chinking. Every draft that penetrated the room carried the lethal bite of the high-altitude freeze. There was no time for hesitation, no space for lingering pride. Ben reached down with one calloused hand and snatched up the single wool blanket they had salvaged from the shack's dilapidated supply chest. It was a heavy, unforgiving piece of fabric. The coarse material was stiff with years of disuse, smelling faintly of stale dust, dry rot, and the sharp tang of raw lanolin. It offered no soft comfort, no gentle domestic luxury. It was a raw, pragmatic barrier against death, woven tight enough to block the wind but rough enough to chafe bare skin raw. Ben practically lifted the younger man off his trembling feet, depositing Billy onto the edge of the bunk. The dry pine boards creaked in sharp protest beneath them. Before Billy could fully register the biting hardness of the wood against his bare thighs, the foreman was moving. Ben crowded into the impossibly narrow space, forcing Billy to slide further toward the frozen log wall to make room for his broad frame. The giant foreman pulled the single wool blanket over their shoulders, throwing it wide in a single motion to cover them both. He worked with a ruthless mechanical efficiency, ignoring the freezing air biting at his own exposed skin. Ben tucked the heavy, scratchy edges of the wool firmly beneath the rope lattice, sealing them into a dark, claustrophobic pocket of trapped air. The fabric scraped against Billy's shoulders, a harsh, abrasive friction that grounded him entirely in the brutal reality of their situation. This was not a haven. It was a desperate trench dug in a war against the elements. The blanket was incredibly heavy, pressing down on their chests with a suffocating weight, but it was the only thing standing between them and the ice. Ben secured the final corner near their feet, ensuring that not a single inch of the deadly mountain draft could penetrate their makeshift shelter. Then came the inevitable touch. As the heavy wool settled securely over them, the desperately narrow dimensions of the bunk forced their bare bodies together. Billy's spine pressed flush against the broad, heavily muscled expanse of Ben's chest. The physical contact was sudden, jarring, and entirely devoid of immediate comfort. Instead of a soothing relief, the younger man experienced a violent, agonizing shock to his nervous system. Ben's skin was a furnace, radiating a deep, unyielding heat built from decades of grueling ranch labor and a massive cardiovascular engine. For Billy, whose core temperature had dropped dangerously close to the fatal edge of hypothermia, the sudden introduction of that intense warmth was physically traumatizing. His frozen, pale flesh rebelled instantly. The cruel physiological reality of the extreme cold took hold. The sudden external heat caused the chilled blood in Billy's frozen extremities to rush back toward his core, a brutal, involuntary phenomenon of afterdrop that made him feel instantly, terrifyingly colder than he had been standing in the snow. It felt as though glacial water had just been injected directly into his veins, shocking his heart and lungs. Billy let out a sharp, involuntary gasp, his breath hitching painfully in his raw throat. He flinched violently, his wiry muscles seizing as he instinctively tried to pull away from the unbearable burning sensation. The heat radiating from the foreman felt like an open flame held directly against frost-bitten skin. It was a searing, prickly agony that made every nerve ending in his shoulders, back, and calves scream in protest. He arched his spine, desperately trying to carve out an inch of freezing air between his icy flesh and the solid wall of heat behind him. But there was nowhere to run. The single wool blanket was tucked too tightly around them, and the frozen log wall of the cabin blocked any forward retreat. More importantly, Benjamin Vance refused to let him pull away. The giant foreman simply shifted his immense weight, effortlessly boxing the frantic wrangler into place. He did not offer soft murmurs or gentle reassurances. Instead, Ben's heavy arm clamped down over Billy's trembling ribs, anchoring the younger man exactly where he needed to be. The grip was absolute, an iron bar of pure physical authority that demanded total physical surrender for the sake of survival. "Hold still," Ben commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated directly through the bones of Billy's shivering chest. The sound was rough, stripped of any polite pretense, resonating with the unquestionable certainty of a man who understood the mechanical reality of staying alive. "It's going to burn before it gets better. Do not pull away from me." Billy squeezed his eyes shut in the absolute dark, his teeth chattering so violently his jaw began to ache. The pain of rewarming was excruciating, 1,000 sharp needles piercing his skin wherever their bodies met. His exhausted frame trembled uncontrollably against the immovable weight of his boss. Ben absorbed the frantic, jerking movements without a single word of complaint, acting as a steady, living anchor in the freezing dark. The sheer physical scale of the Foreman was overwhelming, a solid fortress of muscle and heat that slowly, agonizingly began to overpower the ice in Billy's. The harsh, scratchy wool above them held the brutal heat in, amplifying the intense, uncomfortable friction of their shared survival, forcing them to endure the painful thaw together. The darkness beneath the heavy fabric was absolute, smelling fiercely of lanolin, old dust, and the sharp tang of wood smoke. Benjamin Vance did not pause to consider the fragile boundaries of professional distance that usually separated a ranch foreman from a bunkhouse hand. His massive, calloused palms clamped down over Billy's rigid calves with the practiced, unyielding force of a man accustomed to wrestling yearlings into submission and working stiff, winter-frozen leather until it bent to his will. The motion was entirely mechanical, stripped of any soft sentiment or gentle hesitation. Ben applied a brutal, steady friction, his hands sliding up and down the icy, blue-tinted muscle of the younger man's legs, forcing the sluggish, freezing blood to move back toward a heart that was struggling to keep its rhythm. Billy lay pinned beneath the weight of that relentless effort, his breath hitching in shallow W. Ragged tears of air. The older man's hands felt like coarse sandstone scraping over his numb flesh, the thick calluses snagging slightly on the fine hairs of his legs. It was not a lover's caress. It was a physical command to survive. Ben's broad shoulders shifted in the cramped space, throwing the entirety of his immense upper body weight into the task. He moved with a grim, singular focus, his jaw set, his breathing deep and regulated through his nose. When the calves finally began to lose their stiffness, the giant foreman did not ask for permission to continue. He shifted his grip, moving his huge hands up to Billy's torso, pressing down over the shuddering rib cage. The sheer scale of Ben's palms seemed to cover half of the wrangler's chest, the heat radiating from his rough skin acting like a blazing hearth against the terrifying cold. The pressure was intense, nearly bruising, as Ben rubbed his hands vigorously across the pale, frozen torso, demanding the circulation to wake up. Ben did not speak. Words were entirely useless against the terrifying drop in body temperature, and the foreman had never been a man who wasted breath when action was required. He simply kept his hands moving, working in deep, sweeping motions that pulled the skin taut over Billy's ribs. Every pass of those enormous, rough palms generated a startling amount of friction. The silence inside the cabin, beneath the howling exterior, was punctuated only by the heavy, rhythmic slide of calloused skin against shivering flesh and the deep, even exhalations of the giant laboring over him. Ben's chest rose and fell in time with his hands, a steady, mechanical engine of survival that demanded nothing less than absolute compliance. He braced one thick forearm across Billy's hip, to keep the younger man from flailing away from the uncomfortable pressure, anchoring him to the bunkboard. It was the same physical authority that kept the entire Kincaid Ranch running through the darkest months of the year, distilled down into the span of two hands working relentlessly in the dark. The return of life is rarely a peaceful transition, and for a man who has stood on the precipice of freezing to death, the threshold of thawing is pure, undiluted agony. As the heavy, sluggish blood finally began to flow back through his constricted veins, the numbness shattered. In its place came a searing, agonizing prickle that felt exactly like crushed glass being forced through his circulatory system. Billy let out a sharp, breathless gasp, his entire body seizing up under the single wool blanket. The violent shivering began not as a gradual tremor, but as a sudden, uncontrollable convulsion that rattled the narrow wooden frame of the bunk. His muscles, waking from their icy paralysis, spasmed wildly in desperate attempts to generate their own heat. The pain was sudden and blinding, a cruel reminder that surviving the mountain required a brutal toll. Billy clamped his jaw shut, his teeth grinding together so hard his temples ached. For years he had operated on the strict, unyielding rule that an outcast must never show pain, must never become a burden, must never make a sound that might draw the ire of a boss. He tried to swallow the rising agony, his back arching off the mattress as another violent wave of shivers racked his lean frame. But the torment of the returning circulation was too severe. A broken, ragged groan tore its way past his lips, loud and humiliating in the cramped, intimate dark. The sound was a betrayal of every defensive wall he had built since he first rode onto the Kincaid Range. Terrified of exposing that much raw weakness, and desperate to stifle the involuntary cries that were suddenly bubbling up from his chest, Billy twisted his upper body sideways. He threw his face blindly forward, seeking any barrier to muffle his shame, and ended up burying his face directly into the crook of Benjamin Vance's neck. The impact was clumsy and desperate. Billy's icy nose pressed hard into the warm, salt-dampened skin beneath the older man's collarbone, his mouth opening against the thick cord of muscle on the side of Ben's throat as he released another muffled, agonizing whimper. His chattering teeth clicked accidentally against the foreman's heavy collarbone, a sharp, ungraceful collision that normally would have earned a ranch hand a swift, harsh reprimand. Instead of pulling away from the messy, desperate contact, the giant simply absorbed the impact. Ben did not flinch, nor did he offer any soft, comforting platitudes. He merely shifted his immense shoulder to better accommodate the awkward angle of the younger man's head, creating a hollow, protective pocket of heat where Billy could hide his face in absolute darkness. The coarse stubble along Ben's jawline scraped lightly against Billy's temple, a tactile anchor grounding him in reality. Beneath the rough skin of the foreman's throat, Billy could feel the steady, thunderous, unbothered beat of a slow pulse, a rhythm completely untroubled by the storm outside or the breakdown happening in his arms. Ben simply tightened his massive grip, his calloused hand moving to the center of Billy's back to hold him firmly in place against his chest, letting the younger man ride out the excruciating pain of survival against the solid, unyielding safety of his neck. The wind battered the decaying patrol cabin, a relentless force threatening to tear the roof beams from their frozen joints. Inside, the absolute darkness was broken only by shivering drafts pushing through the chinking. Beneath the single wool blanket, the air was entirely different, dense, heated, and fiercely still. Billy lay perfectly rigid, listening to the cavernous rhythm of the older man's heartbeat against his own chest. The violent tremors that had racked his lean frame were subsiding into involuntary shudders, leaving behind an exhaustion so profound it felt like lead in his bones. Yet, sleep did not come. Instead, the sudden, shocking safety of the space stripped away the iron defenses he had carried across 4 territories. He did not look at the foreman. Even in the pitch black, the sheer proximity of Benjamin Vance was overwhelming, a physical weight demanding absolute honesty. Billy lifted one hand from where it was pinned between their chests, his knuckles brushing against the coarse fabric, and reached up in the dark. His fingertips found the frozen log wall just inches above their makeshift bunk. He traced the rough, uneven grain of the timber, finding a hard knot in the wood and pressing his thumb into the groove. The tactile motion was the only thing keeping him tethered to the present moment, a small anchor against the rising tide of memory. When he finally spoke, his voice was nothing more than a fragile, raspy whisper, barely audible over the howl of the Wyoming storm outside. He did not possess the vocabulary for profound psychological reflection. He was a wrangler, a drifter who understood the world only in terms of survival, harsh winters, and the brutal mechanics of labor. "They ain't exactly battle wounds, Mr. Vance," Billy murmured, his throat working hard to push the words out into the cold air. His thumb continued to rub the knot in the wall, tracing circles in the dark. "The marks, on my back and my ribs. I know you felt 'em." He paused, his breathing shallow, waiting for a rejection that did not come. The silence between them was heavy with listening. "First ranch I worked, down near the Brazos. The boss had a heavy hand with a leather strap. Said I was too slow, too small to be worth the feed. Said a stray dog only learns when you break its spirit." Billy's voice cracked, a dry, painful sound he immediately tried to swallow down. I ran, kept running, but folks talk, and when a hand sees a man with a back like mine, they don't think he's a survivor. They think he's a thief, or just something broken that ain't worth fixing. I reckon I got used to keeping my head down and my collar buttoned, Billy continued. Words spilling out now, driven by an exhaustion too deep to fight. Because the second a man sees what's underneath, the rules change. They look at you like you're ruined stock. I figured if you saw, you'd leave me out here, or send me packing back to Kincaid's with my pay docked and a warning to the rest of the bunkhouse to keep their distance. His thumb stopped moving against the knot, his hand dropping to clutch the edge of the single wool blanket, pulling it tightly to his chin as if the fabric could shield him from the judgment he was certain was coming. Ben did not offer a gentle reassurance. He did not speak a single word of pity, nor did he attempt to dismiss the brutal reality of the frontier that had carved those scars into the younger man's skin. To a man like Benjamin Vance, empty platitudes were worse than lies. They were an insult to the endurance required to survive such cruelty. Instead, the giant Foreman answered with the only language he truly trusted, the absolute, undeniable gravity of physical presence. In the suffocating dark of the timberline cabin, Ben shifted his massive weight. The wooden bunk groaned in protest as he moved, pulling his heavily muscled arm out from beneath the coarse wool to encompass the younger man completely. He did not handle Billy like something fragile. He handled him with the firm, possessive certainty of a man laying claim to something of immense value. The sheer size of his arm wrapped around Billy's shoulders, locking him securely against the broad, heat-radiating expanse of his chest. With slow, deliberate intent, Ben rested his heavy, bearded chin directly on top of Billy's head. The weight of it was grounding, a physical anchor that immediately halted the frantic, spiraling panic in the wrangler's chest. It was a gesture of absolute containment, shielding him from the howling wind outside and the ghosts of his past all at once. The storm continued to batter the decaying logs, the shrieking gale trying desperately to find a way inside, but beneath the fabric, the environment belonged entirely to the Foreman. The silence stretched on, dismantling the rigid, unyielding rules of the Kincaid Range. The massive hands that had spent decades breaking wild horses and enforcing discipline across the territory were now entirely devoted to the quiet, methodical work of providing sanctuary. There was no demand for further explanation, no probing questions about the men who had wielded the strap. There was only the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of Ben's chest, a mechanical, comforting proof of life and endurance. Billy let out a long, shuddering breath, the tension draining out of his muscles in a sudden, overwhelming rush. The realization hit him slowly, seeping into his bones alongside the returning warmth of his blood. The giant Foreman was not disgusted. He was not pulling away. By remaining completely silent and anchoring his heavy chin against the crown of Billy's head, Ben was delivering an unspoken verdict, dismantling years of deeply ingrained shame with the simple refusal to let go. Billy allowed his entire weight to sink heavily against Ben's massive frame. The ambient temperature beneath the single wool blanket was steadily climbing, and the young wrangler finally stopped, holding himself stiffly apart, surrendering the exhausting effort of maintaining his own balance in the dark. The sheer scale of the Foreman offered an architecture of absolute safety. The older man's chest was a broad, unyielding wall of heat, and as the shivering hand rested his ear against the heavy contour of those ribs, the chaotic howling of the storm outside seemed to fade into a secondary concern. Beneath the coarse fabric, Billy tuned his senses to the steady, slow rhythm of Ben's heartbeat. It was a deeply measured cadence, heavy and unhurried, entirely unaffected by the lethal freeze rattling the log cabin's loose chinking. There was no panic in that pulse, only a stubborn, enduring permanence. The runaway closed his eyes, focusing entirely on that deep thudding sound. He consciously began matching his own shallow, erratic breathing to the deep rise and fall of the giant's chest. Inhale, hold, exhale. The shared rhythm became a quiet anchor. As their breathing aligned, the residual shivering in the younger man's extremities finally subsided. The bone-deep ache in his joints, born from hours of gripping frozen leather reins, began to thaw into a heavy, lethargic warmth. He realized with a profound sense of dislocation that he was no longer solely responsible for his own survival. He was being carried, sheltered entirely by the physical strength of another human being. He did not need to speak. There were no declarations of sentiment required. No grand promises needed to bridge the distance between them. The intimacy was forged entirely in the mechanics of survival, in the undeniable reality of two men generating enough friction and heat to keep the winter at bay. Billy just lay there, mapping the rough texture of Ben's arm where it wrapped securely around his shoulders, letting the rhythmic pulse beneath his cheek lull him into a state of deep, restorative calm. The heavy woven wool formed a finite, impenetrable border against the brutal Wyoming wilderness, and inside that border, the terrified runaway ceased to exist, leaving only a man finally finding rest. The heavy silence inside the cramped line shack stretched on, broken only by the intermittent shriek of the wind tearing across the mountain pass. Billy was drifting on the edge of exhaustion when a deep vibration rumbled against his ear, originating deep within the foreman's chest. "I thought I lost you on that ridge." Ben's voice was low and raspy, sounding exactly like gravel scraping together in the dark. The admission lacked any polished grace. It was blunt, torn from the throat of a man who rarely used words when a nod would suffice. Billy shifted slightly under the heavy covering, tilting his chin upward, though the pitch black of the cabin made it impossible to see the older man's face. The foreman's massive hand moved, just a fraction, the calloused palm settling more firmly against the center of his partner's back. 11 years I've run this crew for Jasper," Ben continued, the rough syllables vibrating through the cramped space beneath the single wool blanket. "I've pulled men out of stampedes, dug them out of mudslides, bound up broken legs when the horses spooked." He paused, taking a slow, measured breath that expanded his ribs against the younger man's cheek. The stoic giant was meticulously dismantling his own armor, offering a rare, quiet confession anchored entirely in the harsh responsibilities of his position. "The rule is simple. You ride out with me, you ride back. I don't leave my hands behind on the mountain." The gravelly voice caught, just slightly, betraying a crack in the iron facade. "But when the snow blinded us past the timberline, and I saw you drop those reins, I saw how blue your mouth was getting." Ben's fingers twitched against the spine they were protecting, a phantom reflex of panic that the giant had successfully hidden during the crisis. "I calculated the distance to this shack. I did the math on how long it takes a man your size to freeze solid in a crosswind." Billy lay perfectly still, absorbing the raw weight of the confession. He had always viewed the foreman as an immovable force of nature, a towering authority who felt no fear and made no miscalculations. To hear this immense figure admit to terror, not for himself, but for the fragile life of a junior wrangler, rewrote the entire foundation of their dynamic. "It wasn't about the herd anymore," Ben murmured, his tone dropping so low it was almost indistinguishable from the storm outside. "It was just about getting you behind a door. I've carried a lot of weight on this ranch, boy. But the thought of hauling your frozen body back down to the valley." The foreman let the sentence trail off into the dark, the unfinished thought hanging heavier than any spoken word. He didn't need to finish it. The tightness of the arm wrapped around Billy's shoulders communicated the rest. Ben's vulnerability was rooted not in flowery romanticism, but in the brutal, pragmatic reality of frontier survival. The fear of failing his duty had morphed into the terror of losing the one person who had unknowingly slipped past his defenses. Billy pressed his face deeper into the heat of the broad chest, offering the only comfort he could, anchoring the giant just as securely as he had been anchored himself. The timberline storm did not surrender with the passing hours. If anything, the sudden October blizzard intensified, hurling itself against the decaying patrol cabin with the weight of a runaway freight train. The wind howled through the high-altitude pass, a sound like something being spoken very quietly in a language that had no exact translation, amplified until it shrieked against the frost-heaved logs. Above them, the wooden rafters groaned in protest under the accumulating mass of wet, heavy alpine snow. The entire structure trembled with each violent, unpredictable gust, causing ancient dust motes to shake loose from the dry, rotted ceiling and dance wildly in the pitch-black air. It was the kind of merciless weather that buried cattle standing up and froze men before they even realized they were tired. Yet, inside the sanctuary of the single wool blanket, the physical warmth remained absolute. Billy lay perfectly still, listening to the destruction outside while utterly insulated from its lethal bite. The freezing ambient air of the room nipped at the crown of his head and the tip of his nose, a harsh, stinging reminder of the death that waited only inches away. But everything below his collarbone was submerged in a heavy, radiating heat. Ben's massive frame acted as a human furnace in the dark. The foreman's broad chest was a solid wall of dense muscle and steady heartbeats, anchoring the younger man in a physical reality that felt entirely disconnected from the chaos tearing at the roof overhead. The sensory contrast was dizzying. Out there, the Wyoming frontier was actively attempting to erase them from the map. In here, beneath the coarse, scratchy fabric, the vast world had shrunk down to the friction of skin and the quiet, rhythmic expansion of shared lungs. A sudden, deep rumble vibrated violently through the rough floorboards. A heavy, compacted layer of accumulated snow had finally broken loose, sliding off the pitched roof in a massive avalanche of ice and timber-shaking force. It hit the frozen ground outside with a deafening thud that rattled the iron hinges of the cabin door, and sent a spray of white powder through the gaps in the window shutters. Instinct should have made the young wrangler flinch. A mere few hours ago, any loud, unexpected noise would have sent him scrambling backward into a defensive panic, utterly convinced the brittle shelter was caving in on them. But as the avalanche settled into a heavy, suffocating silence, Billy did not move a single muscle. He did not even blink in the darkness. Ben's arm was wrapped securely around his waist, an immovable weight draped over his ribs, and that overwhelming presence overrode every ingrained survival instinct the boy possessed. Neither man shifted away from the contact. Thamik Christophas Bose, they remained completely anchored in each other, letting the mountain tear itself apart while they simply existed in the quiet, undeniable center of the storm. As midnight slowly bled into the early, desolate hours of the morning, the night reached its absolute coldest peak. The temperature inside the drafty shack plummeted even further, the last fleeting memory of residual warmth from the long-dead hearth completely gone. Frost began to rapidly crystallize on the inside of the rough-hewn log walls, creeping over the cracked sandstone of the chimney and tracing pale, icy veins across the uneven wooden floorboards. The breath leaving Billy's lips plumed thick and white in the dark, visible even in the faint ghostly moonlight that managed to filter through the shutter cracks. The cold was a physical entity in the room, pressing against them from all sides. But the biting, relentless chill only made the sanctuary of the single wool blanket more profound. A silent, heavy understanding settled between them in the cramped, narrow bunk. There were no grand declarations required, no desperate romantic promises whispered into the freezing shadows, and no pressing need to untangle the complicated mess of the professional hierarchy they had left down in the valley. The rules were still the rules, the work was still the work, and the massive Kincaid Range stretched out around them in the freezing dark, but in this isolated, hidden pocket of survival, none of that mattered. Ben shifted slightly in the dark, his massive chest expanding as he drew in a slow, deep, measured breath. His large, calloused hand, the exact same hand that could break a wild, bucking colt or swing a heavy blacksmith hammer for hours without tiring, rested heavily against the fragile curve of Billy's spine. Slowly, deliberately, the giant began to move his palm in a rhythmic, unhurried motion. It was a gesture of profound, quiet devotion, rubbing a steady, generating friction into the younger man's back to keep the creeping mountain chill away. The rough, working man texture of the Foreman's skin rasped softly against bare flesh, establishing a grounding, tactile rhythm that communicated absolute safety infinitely better than any words ever could. Billy closed his eyes, surrendering completely, letting his cheek rest flat against the older man's solid collarbone. The steady, heavy, repeated pressure of that hand, moving up and down his spine, was methodically dismantling a lifetime of iron personal rules like fence posts pulled from frozen ground. The chronic exhaustion of surviving alone, of constantly guarding his own scars and hiding his vulnerabilities from a hostile, unforgiving frontier, was being gently washed away by the simple, repetitive motion of a caretaker's touch. They did not speak. The wind continued to scream outside, aggressively battering the fragile wooden walls, but the terror had been completely drained from the air. In the deepest, most dangerous hours of the October freeze, the most intimidating, strict man on the entire Kincaid Ranch had become the only true unconditional shelter Billy had ever known. As the rhythmic, unending pressure of that massive palm lulled him toward a deep, dreamless sleep, the young wrangler knew with absolute certainty that the unspoken boundaries between them had been irrevocably erased. The morning did not announce itself with warmth, but rather with a profound ringing stillness that stretched for miles across the timberline. The relentless wind that had threatened to tear the roof from the decaying line shack had finally exhausted itself sometime before dawn. In its wake, a heavy, muffled quiet settled over the Wyoming range. Billy opened his eyes slowly, his lashes heavy, blinking against the pale, fractured light that was beginning to bleed through the single small window pane near the door. He did not move immediately. For the first time in his life, waking up did not involve a sudden defensive flinch or the immediate need to calculate his own safety. He was entirely cocooned, wrapped tight within the single wool blanket and anchored securely against the steady, massive heat of the Foreman's chest. The older man's heavy arm was still slung over his waist, a quiet, immovable weight that kept the bitter chill of the cabin at bay. The air inside the shack was still sharpened to see with every exhale, hanging in small, white clouds that plumed and faded in the dimness. The young wrangler watched his own breath rise, then felt the deep, rhythmic expansion of Ben's chest against his spine, their breathing out of sync but sharing the exact same freezing air. As the gray light of dawn slowly intensified, catching the edges of the rough-hewn log walls, he noticed the thick layer of frost coating the inside of the window pane. The ice was intricately patterned, resembling jagged ferns and frozen rivers, but near the center of the glass, the edges of the frost were beginning to weep. A single, slow bead of moisture gathered and rolled down the pane. It was a tiny, impossible victory. The sheer accumulation of their shared body heat, trapped beneath the heavy fabric over the course of the long night, was actually beginning to melt the ice on the glass. He stared at that single drop of water for a long time. It felt like watching a miracle that no one else would ever understand. The fear that had paralyzed him the night before, the terror of exposure, the desperate need to hide his vulnerability, had vanished, replaced by a grounded stillness. The wrangler shifted slightly, just enough to test the feeling in his toes. The numbness was completely gone, replaced by the normal dull ache of a hard day's work. Behind him, the giant shifted in his sleep, the deep rumble of his breathing hitching for a fraction of a second before settling back into an even rhythm. His massive, calloused hand flexed unconsciously, fingers curling just a fraction tighter into the fabric of the boy's shirt, a silent assertion of protection. The storm outside had cleared, leaving a pristine world buried under deep snow, but inside the narrow confines of the bunk, the fundamental reality of his existence had been permanently altered. Eventually, the practical demands of the morning could no longer be ignored. The cold within the room was absolute, biting at their faces and reminding them that the sanctuary of the bunk was temporary. Ben stirred first, his vast frame shifting the mattress as he sat up. the cold air rushing in as the blanket fell away from his shoulders. He did not say a word, his expression returning to the stoic, impenetrable mask of the Kincaid Ranch foreman, but his eyes, when they briefly caught the younger man's, held a steady, grounding warmth that had never been there before. They moved in tandem, stepping out onto the freezing wooden floorboards. The air shocked Billy's system, raising goosebumps along his arms, but the panic from the previous evening was entirely absent. He reached for his clothes, draped over the rusted frame of the stove. The denim was incredibly stiff, still carrying a deep chill, but it was no longer the deadly, ice-soaked armor that had threatened to stop his heart. Dressing in the freezing cabin was a slow, mechanical process. He pulled the stiff flannel over his head, hands steady, while beside him the older man moved with the unhurried grace of someone who belonged entirely to the harsh landscape. The giant pulled on his own heavy shirt, the broad expanse of his chest disappearing beneath the rugged fabric. Then came the trousers, the rough material sliding over skin that still radiated the deep heat of their shared night. As the foreman fastened his belt, the sound cut through the quiet room. It was the loud, echoing clink of his heavy brass belt buckle snapping into place. The metallic sound hung in the air for a long moment. Only 12 hours earlier, that exact noise had been the catalyst that shattered his defenses. Now, the sharp click of the heavy brass belt buckle signaled something else entirely. It was the drawing of a line, the physical restoration of their professional roles before they stepped back out into the unforgiving world of the ranch. To anyone else, the foreman was simply gearing up for the brutal work of the day. But to the young hand, standing just 3 feet away, the sound no longer carried the threat of rigid authority. The silence that followed the click was no longer a hollow, dangerous void waiting to be filled with harsh commands. It was a thick, protective quiet. Ben finished adjusting the strap, his massive hands resting briefly on his hips as he looked down at him. The storm-gray eyes registered the slight shiver in the wrangler's shoulders, but this time, there was no need for drastic measures. The giant simply reached out, his rough, calloused fingers brushing briefly against the collar of the coat, straightening the fabric with a touch so fleeting it might have been imagined. It was a gesture of profound, unspoken care, an acknowledgement that the boundary between them had been permanently redrawn. The rules of the Kincaid Range would demand obedience. The work would demand sweat and exhaustion, but the space between the giant foreman and his quiet hand would forever belong to the heat forged in this cabin. Billy met his gaze, his own jaw tightening not in fear, but in absolute, fierce loyalty, ready to follow the man out into the blinding white snow. The morning air outside the cabin possessed a crystalline sharpness that burned the lungs with every drawn breath, the sky above a pale, hard blue, devoid of clouds and merciless in its clarity. They rode down the mountain trail in a silence that was entirely unlike the heavy, defensive quiet they had shared the day before. The snowdrifts were deep enough that the horses had to high step, their heavy hooves punching through the frozen crust with a steady, rhythmic crunching sound that echoed across the empty valley. The breath of the animals plumed like chimney smoke in the freezing air, mingling with the mist rising from their own tired mouths. Every joint in William Morrison's body ached with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, the kind of weariness that came from surviving the edge of a frozen grave. Yet as he gripped the frozen leather reins, his chest felt strangely hollowed out, wiped clean of the perpetual gnawing fear that had defined Ned his entire adult life. They did not speak of what had happened under the coarse wool blanket. The rules of the frontier did not require sweeping declarations or spoken vows to make a thing real. The truth of their survival was etched into the landscape around them, into the steady mechanical rhythm of their descent toward the valley floor. Benjamin Vance rode his massive roan, gelding with the same stoic, unreadable posture he always maintained, his broad shoulders blocking the worst of the headwind. But the geography of their movement had shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore. On the treacherous, snow-packed switchbacks, where professional distance usually demanded at least 10 yards of spacing, the giant Foreman kept his mount crowded tight against the younger man's side. The massive shoulder of Ben's roan occasionally brushed against the edge of Billy's frozen leather stirrup, a solid anchoring thud that communicated more than words ever could. It was a subtle, deliberate trespass of the rigid boundaries that governed ranch hierarchy, executed with the unhurried certainty of a man claiming his own territory. Whenever a deep snowdrift threatened to unbalance Billy's tired horse, that heavy brushing contact returned, a physical tether ensuring the wrangler remained upright and safe. Billy did not pull away. Instead, he leaned slightly into the proximity, allowing the ambient heat of the larger animal and the towering man beside him to act as a shield against the biting wind. He kept his eyes fixed on the trail ahead, but his jaw relaxed, and the defensive tension that normally locked his shoulders into a tight knot finally began to unravel. The vast, empty wilderness of the territory had always felt like a threat of erasure, a place where a man could disappear without a trace. Now, surrounded by endless miles of isolating snow, the proximity of the Foreman transformed the desolate range into a quiet sanctuary. They rode onward through the morning glare, navigating the treacherous descent not as a boss and a hired hand, but as a unified front bound by the weight of a shared secret. The main gates of the Kincaid Ranch finally appeared through the distant tree line just before noon, the rough-hewn timber posts nearly swallowed by the drifting snow. The yard was already a hive of necessary labor, with men scattered across the frozen mud, breaking ice in the water troughs and shoveling paths to the main barn. At the center of the frantic activity stood Jasper Kincaid, the uncompromising owner of the spread. Jasper was a man who measured worth in calluses and obedience, enforcing a strict code of professional distance that kept his massive operation running through the harshest seasons. He stood near the corral fence in a heavy canvas coat, kept his weathered face set in a grim, calculating frown as he surveyed the damage of the blizzard. When he caught sight of the two riders emerging from the timberline, the rigid posture of his spine visibly slumped, a sudden, heavy exhalation of profound relief escaping into the frigid air. Jasper stepped forward, his boots crunching through the frozen mud as Ben and Billy guided their exhausted horses into the yard. The ranch owner did not offer a warm greeting or a sentimental embrace, because that was not the language of the frontier. He simply nodded, his sharp eyes taking in the frost-covered coats, the stiff movements of the riders, and the undeniable fact that they had survived a night that should have killed them. But as Billy awkwardly dismounted, his frozen boots hitting the ground with a clumsy thud, Jasper's gaze narrowed. He watched as the giant Foreman immediately swung down from his own saddle, his massive frame moving with surprising speed to stand directly behind the younger man. Ben did not touch the wrangler, but his presence was a physical barricade, his broad chest positioned to catch his partner if those exhausted legs happened to give out. The foreman's dark eyes swept over the busy yard, silently daring any of the other hands to step too close or ask too many questions. It was a blatant, protective stance that completely defied the rigid, unwritten laws of the bunkhouse. A foreman did not hover over a common wrangler. A foreman did not track a boy's breathing with the hyper-vigilant focus of a hawk guarding a nest. Jasper took a slow drag from his cigar, the glowing cherry illuminating the deep lines around his mouth. He was a hard man who demanded absolute order, but he also understood the brutal, unforgiving nature of the land he worked. He saw the way Billy's shoulders instinctively angled back toward Ben's massive chest for unconscious support, and he saw the quiet, fierce devotion radiating from the giant who had always been nothing more than a solitary enforcer of rules. Jasper Kincaid held the stare of his foreman for a long, heavy moment. Then the older man simply looked away, tapping the ash from his cigar into the snow. He turned his back on the silent claim being made in the center of his yard, quietly accepting the permanent shift in their dynamic without uttering a single word of condemnation. The unspoken rules had changed, and the work of the range stretched out around them in the cold daylight. 10 winters had swept across the Kincaid Valley since that October freeze. The passage of a decade on the frontier was measured in the weathering of fence posts and the quiet rhythm of accumulated seasons. The March morning was mild, the sun pale and low, casting long shadows across a thin layer of snow. William Morrison sat tall in his saddle, his breath plumbing in the crisp air alongside the steady exhalations of his bay gelding. He was no longer the shivering, defensive greenhorn who had nearly lost his life on the high timberline. His shoulders had broadened, filled out by years of relentless labor. He moved with a relaxed authority, signaling with a gloved hand to a pair of younger wranglers to push a stubborn knot of yearlings toward the lower pasture. Billy handled the reins with a casual grace, his voice carrying over the frosted ground, firm, clear, and devoid of the old fear. From a low ridge 100 yards away, Benjamin Vance watched the maneuver. The foreman was still a silent giant of a man, though the years had dusted his temples with iron gray. His massive frame rested easily in the saddle, his storm-gray eyes tracking the younger man's confident movement. There was no need to bark orders. The herd was managed with a methodical, unhurried precision that mirrored his own teachings. The rancher sat there, observing the intricate dance of horses and cattle, radiating a profound, quiet pride. It was the deep satisfaction of seeing a wounded thing heal, take root, and thrive. The cattle lowed, their hooves punching through the crust of the snow. It was the daily labor of sharing a life in hard country, the monotonous, beautiful routine of mending and tending, of keeping things alive. Billy pulled his collar up against a sudden bite of wind, feeling the solid, heavy fabric of his coat. He had been warm for 10 years. The chronic exhaustion of surviving alone had been replaced by a structural, permanent safety. Turning his horse, Billy caught sight of the massive silhouette on the ridge. He merely offered a single brief nod. The gesture was small, nearly imperceptible to the other hands, but it carried the weight of a private language built over thousands of shared days and nights. Ben nodded back, touching 2 thick, calloused fingers to the brim of his hat before pulling his horse around to follow the herd. By the time the sun dipped below the jagged western peaks, the day's labor was finally done. The main yard of the ranch grew quiet, leaving only the sound of the wind moving through the cottonwoods. Billy and Ben walked shoulder to shoulder toward the secluded cabin set back near the tree line, a physical sanctuary they had built up with their own hands. It stood apart from the rest of the operation, its thick log walls offering an impenetrable defense against the prying eyes of the world. Inside, the cast-iron stove was already radiating a steady, dry heat. The scent of wood smoke and roasted coffee filled the small space. Billy set his hat on the peg by the door and moved toward the kitchen counter to pour a basin of hot water. He rolled up the sleeves of his flannel shirt, the lantern light catching the faded scars on his forearms, marks that no longer carried any shame, only the quiet history of his survival. Behind him, the heavy thud of boots hitting the floorboards echoed in the quiet room. The massive foreman stood near center of the cabin, rolling his shoulders to ease the stiffness of a long day in the saddle. He reached down to his waist. In the warm, silent sanctuary of their home, the thick brass unclasped with a sharp, familiar sound. The heavy brass belt buckle dropped with a loud, resounding clink against the rough timber floor, ringing out exactly as it had in a freezing line shack 10 years ago. Billy stopped washing his hands. He turned around, leaning his hip against the wooden counter, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face. He looked at the giant man standing in the center of the room, taking in the sheer scale of the protector who had risked his life and his standing for him. The rules of the Kincaid Range were still the rules, the daily labor was still the labor, but within these 4 timber walls they belonged to no one but each other. Crossing his arms over his chest, his eyes gleaming with a warm private mischief, the former wrangler let out a soft breath. "That was just my belt buckle, cowboy," Billy murmured. his voice dropping an octave, perfectly mimicking the rough, gravelly tone of the man in front of him. Ben froze for a fraction of a second. Then a rare, rumbling grin broke across his weathered face. It wasn't a fleeting smile, but a deep, permanent expression of absolute domestic safety. The massive Foreman crossed the room in 2 long strides, his huge, calloused hands reaching out to cup Billy's jaw. The touch was completely gentle, a stark contrast to his overwhelming physical scale. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Ben simply pulled the younger man against his broad chest, burying his face in the crook of his neck. The silence that followed had weight and shape and warmth, a contained thing held between 4 walls. Home was no longer a place on a map. It was the man beside him, the silent bond they had forged, the permanent life they were building together. The frontier did not forgive weakness, but it rewarded the quiet courage required to lay down your defenses and trust someone to stay.